I think, Glenn, we should start. So just from myself, I'm Samantha Wakefield. I'm the People Management and HR Lead at the CHS Alliance, and a very warm welcome to our webinar on Transforming Surge Capacity Project. And this is the summary of the research that Glenn O'Neill and Lewis Austin have been working on to date. We are going to start with a short summary of the project from Lucy at ActionAid, and then Glenn is going to present to us, and then we're going to have a discussion and give you a chance to ask any questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, rather than interrupting Glenn, it would be great if you could type them in the question box, and then I will facilitate that once Glenn has finished. I've put you all on mute for now, just because background noise can be a bit distracting, but I do have the power to unmute you if you want to speak towards the end of the presentation too. So a big thank you to Lucy and Glenn, and first of all, I'm going to hand over to Lucy.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Sam. So yeah, welcome to this webinar. I'm Lucy and I work with ActionAid International, and I'm the current focal point for the Transforming Surge Capacity project. So this research that Glenn is about to present was part of the 3-year Transforming Surge Capacity project, which was funded by DFID through the DFID DEP portfolio. And that ended in March this year, with some elements of the project continuing in Pakistan, Philippines, and Bangkok for the region, which have secured funding to continue, which is great news. So it was a consortium project of 11 agencies and technical partners, including CDAC and the CHS Alliance. And the project was led by ActionAid. So I'm just going to give a quick top-line overview of the project, and we'll then hand over to Glenn. So if you'd like any more information about the project, we can send links to resources. We have a nice summary sheet actually with all the resources that were produced within the project. And of course, you can contact me at any point for any more information. So I'll just first start with the definition of surge that came out of the project. So this was an updated definition. So surge capacity is the ability of organisations, communities and individuals in crisis to rapidly and effectively respond to the needs of affected populations through improved local preparedness, collaborative efforts and the scaling up and down of responses. So that's the definition we've kind of been working to. So how did it work? So first, the project wanted to understand the current state of surge in the sector and how it was evolving. So the first thing the project did was in 2015 completed the state of surge in the humanitarian sector, a piece of research that included data from over 50 members of humanitarian agencies and the private and public sector. So the next step of the project was to look at how to take forward recommendations from that research and look at how surge capacity in the sector could be transformed. So the next phase was piloting and building evidence to respond to these questions. So we focused the pilots across 2 national platforms in Pakistan and the Philippines, and an Asia regional platform, and also an international platform. So the project focused on Asia due to the frequency and scale of sudden onset emergencies. So across each of those platforms, INGOs and national NGOs came together to lead activities and gather learning. So Plan led our regional platform, Christian Aid is leading the Philippines platform, and ActionAid led the Pakistan platform. So the project essentially provided seed funding for those platforms to understand surge in their context, such as the Philippines, rather than looking at one single agency. And then funds were then used to pilot different approaches, such as rosters. And finally, in the project, we also consolidated learning. So we have a Future for Surge learning report, and there are many events as well throughout the project. So what did the project achieve? So we live modelled collaborative and localised rosters. The rosters were designed, led and owned at country and regional levels, so 600 members across our platforms from INGOs, partners and the public sector. And we piloted deployments across 7 global emergencies in 2017. There were pilots to explore INGO collaborations with the private sector, UN, public sector and local partners. We worked alongside the CHS and the consortium to develop a selection of resources on HR surge good practice. So there's an online portal for that we can share with you, managed by the CHS Alliance. So lots of really good resources on there. Again, there's a significant portfolio of research, which Glenn was involved in most of those. So we can share those with you. And we also developed an open source surge behaviours training. So this was collectively developed with input from over 11 agencies. So that's all available to use. So yeah, that's the project in a nutshell. So the next step, so funding finished at the end of March for the majority, for the kind of project itself, although some streams of work continue in the region and countries. So we want to continue the working group, to continue to share learning, take forward these discussions, and also look for funding to continue this work, because the momentum is there to continue it. The evaluation said, it would be great to continue this project, especially because we didn't have much time to pilot the ideas. So to get more funding to do this would be great. So I'm happy to share with you as well terms of reference of the working group, so you can join if you're interested. Okay, so thanks everyone. I'm now going to hand you over to Glenn O'Neill, who's been working on a number of pieces of work in the project and is going to give us a summary of this particular piece of work.
Thanks, Lucy. Yes, as Lucy said, the project really had many different aspects, and I'm going to talk mainly about the research that we did, and particularly the tracking mechanism that we had in place. And I draw on some of the other areas of the work of the project, but as Lucy said, really what the project produced is quite impressive in terms of learning and research. So there's really a lot, if you're interested in the area, to explore. So we'll jump right in. I think my presentation will maybe take about 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. Sam, can you move to the next slide? I think I don't manage to control it, but yeah, thanks. So here we can see basically what we were looking at. This was part of the research where we were basically tracking crises throughout the project's lifetime. So over that time, we managed to track 5 crises and one more thematic area, which you can see on the right-hand side on the screen, is the slow onset crises. So really the focus here was really on the surge responses of these 11 operational agencies that you could see on the previous slide, some major international NGOs and their partners. So that were part of the project. So we have to be aware, as I put here, it's a limited sample. So when I'm talking about the tracking, we tracked what these agencies did in any of these crises. So, we tracked what ActionAid, CAFOD, Plan, Islamic Relief, etc., CARE did in these particular crises. Of course, we also looked and saw what other actors did and what their partners did, what did the UN do, what did the local authorities do, but our main focus was on these organizations. It was also mainly focused on Asia, but also we touched on Haiti. We did one tracking piece on Haiti, and also Zimbabwe as part of the slow onset crisis. And just to say that what we did was basically, in terms of methodology, for each of these crises. We basically carried out survey with the INGOs that were there on the ground. So of our 11 operational agencies, for example, in Nepal earthquake, I think all of them were present, but for example, in the Bangladesh floods, only 6 or 7 were present. So it was also based on who was there on the ground. And then we looked at any other available research information. So there were sort of rapid reviews in terms of what we had available with us. So moving on to the next point, the next slide, Sam, is here we had actually, I won't go into this detail, but Lucy already mentioned this is a sort of definition of what we consider surge capacity. So it's really that it was traditionally thought of that sort of, going in and helping the population, massive sort of influx of people, but it sort of has evolved over the years. And then you can see this revised definition, which talks about, it is that initial response, the scaling up, but also the scaling down, which is important, but it's also feeds into local preparedness and collaboration. So that's also important in terms of like in that initial push into a given country. Now, I just want to go on the next slide. We can see here what are the major surge trends, and here what we did is drawing out of these 6 reports that we did and the wider surge project to some extent. We drew out these sort of what I would say 5 trends that we could see, and I'm just going to go through them one by one. So the very first one, on the next slide, sorry, Sam. So what does this mean in terms of like collaboration? We asked the INGOs that were part of the project, to what extent they worked in a collaborative way. And here you can see the percentages are basically like in the Nepal earthquake, 70% of those INGOs, so out of those 7 out of 10 said that they mainly worked in collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. So collaboration actually, it is sort of, we think, increasing across crises, but of course it is also reliant very much on certain factors, notably the context with which is it in. For example, in a context like the Bangladesh floods, this was mainly local partners that were operational for the floods, local NGOs, and so they already had, in many cases, also the local offices of the INGOs. They already had well-established offices that already had a collaboration, so they worked very much in a collaborative way. Compared to Hurricane Matthew in Haiti, where you can see people reported collaboration at 50%. This was also because it was much harder, according to the agencies, to establish partnerships with local partners and also to work amongst themselves, because there were some coordination, of course, set up, but it was much more agencies working by themselves. And that also was related to the fact that the local setup and network and preparedness with local actors and their links with the INGOs were weaker than compared to situations of, for example, Bangladesh. And then we go more recently to the Rohingya response in Bangladesh. And here was also the context that also in a way forced many INGOs and actors also to collaborate based on the way that the authorities also wanted to see the operation. And also, for example, some INGOs were not able to go on the ground, so they were basically the only way they could actually participate was to collaborate with another INGO and national partners. So that it was sort of like, in a way, collaboration was sort of, we could say, in a way, forced upon them in some respects, according to those that were there on the ground. But certainly, collaboration is certainly something that we have seen it is increasing, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next couple of minutes on that. Now, the next point, the next sort of trend that we saw, this one, if we can go, Sam, sorry, to the next slide, about funding and staff moving closer to the crises. Here we can see a relatively straightforward example, which just basically shows what we monitored in terms of the local compared to the international surge staff. So who was working on surge response for these INGOs. And you can see that from the ratio from Nepal to Rohingya basically increased for the amount of staff that were local compared to international. And it's true that basically what we have seen is a trend is that surge staff tend to be mobilized more locally or from neighboring or regional countries. At the same time, from the question of funding, there are more opportunities now opened up for local NGOs and also INGO officers in the countries to apply directly to funding through the START fund, through the UN pooled funding mechanism. So more and more funding opportunities are opening up, although it remains a major challenge, particularly for local NGOs and partners to have access to funds. But quite interesting, over these past 3 years, what has happened is that basically all of the INGOs have basically introduced mechanisms where the local officers can have access, often within 24 hours, to funds to respond immediately. And that's something relatively new that we saw. Once again, that's for the INGOs. For the local and national partners, it's still really not there yet. So going on to the next slide in terms of like also another trend, the skill set is changing. Here on the graph, we can see over these whole 6 crises, we can see these are the areas where the INGOs that we track were most active. So some classic areas such as WASH, food, management and coordination also, but also logistics, but also perhaps surprisingly communications. In terms of communications, mainly focused on affected populations and to a lesser extent, communications back to their home publics as their INGOs, for example, to their population back home, often also for fundraising reasons. So we have this sort of like, classic areas where the INGOs and their partners are working, but at the same time, we can see on the bullet points, there are sort of like the skill set is changing in that we can see that in some areas, I put here new and old because a lot of these are not actually new, but they're old ones that are being reinforced, such as gender, protection, communications, relatively new cash programming. Also, so these are the areas where the INGOs and their partners said, this is where we are needing more and more staff with these skills in these areas. Also, the ability to work with local partners and also local authorities is a clear need and ask of the organizations. And also understanding the humanitarian development nexus, that sort of terrible term that is used, we could say, but it basically means the ability to understand, how development actors link in to the humanitarian area. Also that when we look in some contexts, for example, Philippines during NOC 10, if you saw the local actors who were responding, a lot of those local NGOs were basically development NGOs that then, stepped up to help in the crisis. So in terms of understanding how they work and their needs, that's what we mean, and more skills are needed in this area. That ability, to work with these sort of partners and collaborate and understand from their perspective. So we will move on to the next
Glenn,
trend. Yes.
can I just check, are you using a microphone? Because there's a little bit of feedback. Not much, but are you using a microphone? And if you are, could you just move it slightly away?
Okay, yeah, I'm
It's
using a
okay,
microphone.
but it just, yeah, it might be better. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I'm using a microphone. Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks. Yeah, no,
Okay,
it was fine,
sorry.
but this is better.
Thanks, sir. So sort of like what we have here, up here the, basically the benefits of preparation. So what do we mean here is certainly that a lot of the organizations, also the local authorities, local partners have put a lot of effort in the past years in terms of preparation, in terms of for themselves, for the communities, the structures. And here, I mean, we can see that this benefits of preparation, certainly the benefits are being seen. We saw examples where it led to, quicker, more appropriate and sustainable responses. And some of that preparation that we saw that contributed to this was, for example, establishing partnerships and relationships with local actors and other stakeholders. So certainly that paid off for the INGOs, as we saw in certain countries, for example, the Philippines. And where it didn't pay off was in countries where Haiti, where some of the INGOs reported that they had not established those sort of relationships previously, and that they sort of felt that was also led to their sort of weaker response in some regards. Also, investing in staff training and team building. We heard that the project also had a joint training approach modules, also which was used for many of the organizations. So this also, we saw that by doing that, investing in that, certainly helped staff and partners to be able to better respond. Defining the roles of existing staff. So what happens for in many crises, the first responders, the communities, the local partners, and then within the INGOs, it's the staff that are there on the ground. So these staff might be doing other roles, but in terms of like organizations have also made an effort to sort of define what should those staff do in a crisis and train them accordingly. And that seems to have also certainly helped. Putting in place search plans and systems. This is also not only organizations, but from the level of the governments and the authorities. Like despite crises such as Nepal earthquake being very much overwhelming for all involved, the fact that the authorities and local partners had put in disaster plans and set up certain systems at the level of community committees, disaster response committees, according to people on the ground, this did have some positive benefits in terms of being able to get organized and respond relatively quickly. And lastly, I think the point being about having certainly having access to funding for the crisis, as I mentioned, pre-arranged. And I said a lot of the INGOs have developed that in the last 3 years. As I saw, that was really key to be able to access funding rapidly and not wait for the donor appeal or the release of funds. And virtually all of the INGOs now have that in place, sort of contingency emergency funding. And as I said, it still remains a challenge for many of the local partners in that respect. So going on to the last sort of trend that we saw, the nature of search response is changing. So certainly what we have seen over the 3 years, looking at the crisis as we tracked and the other trends wider, certainly the certain things have certainly changed and evolved. What we have seen is that the capacity of the local actors and authorities has increased. So this has perhaps one aspect. It's positive in that then it means the communities, local actors are closer to the response, more involved. At the same time, this is challenging for the traditional search coordination and leadership, which is traditionally led by the UN, the cluster systems and the systems they put in place, the emergency systems they put in place, and the INGOs are often part of that. So this reinforced capacity has actually, in a way, challenged this traditional international approach to the leadership in many crises. The second point we have here is that humanitarian organizations are moving more towards women-led responses, greater community participation. So we did see where the actual response design and the way they were doing it in terms of a collaborative way, and many organizations have understood that, for example, the first responders in the ground are often communities, often women that then have to respond and organize the families and their communities. So getting them involved in the community wider leads to more effective responses. And so organizations are moving in that direction. Also led to that sort of push also to have very much, to listen more to the community and to participate rather than just coming and imposing what the organizations believe is best. Also, we mentioned at the very start, we are seeing collaboration between organizations in terms of funding requests. A lot of the funding agencies are pushing to see more consortiums to come together, and we see that with the INGOs and local partners, for example, So that is occurring, and we saw examples of that in the Nokten, in the Bangladesh floods, where consortiums of INGOs and local partners came together and then they did do some joint responses, not always. Also training, as we mentioned before, the joint rosters that were set up as part of this project, for example, the Asia level roster, there was rosters set up at the national level in Pakistan and the Philippines. For example, the Asia level roster, Go Asia, that also allowed, for example, for agencies that were not involved, for example, in the Bangladesh floods or the Rohingya response, to be able to free up their staff to be, for example, deployed by other agencies. So the roster worked in that way. So we also have the other rosters, such as, for example, the CDAC roster of communicators, for example. So we do see some growth in this area, not growth, but where agencies and organizations are collaborating together and sharing. It's starting, but it's not necessarily the main way of working so far. And also in needs assessment, we had good examples, for example, in the Bangladesh floods, where there was a joint needs assessment led by CARE, if I recall correctly, involving the authorities, local actors, INGOs, and that really helped then set the overall response for the Bangladesh floods. And in other crises where there wasn't really a joint needs assessment made, from what we could see across the board, that there was also challenges faced. In some cases, it was because perhaps the crisis was very overwhelming in some respects. And lastly, on this point, yes, surge responders, as I mentioned, the sort of makeup of who is the staff responding, they're becoming, we could say, more homegrown. So certainly from more people from the given country and also from the region. This is certainly the case that we see in Asia. It may not yet be in other regions, but also I've worked recently in Latin America, and I saw the Ecuador response to the earthquake. And there you had a lot of the actual responders coming from international organizations, UN, also were coming from neighboring countries, also because of the language, the commonality. And so certainly the feeling and the finding from this research is that, the surge responders who are from the region, from the country neighboring, of course, it makes sense that they're able to have a better reading of the culture and to be able to respond in a more appropriate way in many cases. Now, the last point I wanted to make on the next slide basically is, before I conclude and hand over to questions, is also we just pointed out some of the sort of what we would call the key challenges that we identified across these 6 crisis tracking. So I think some of the first one is access to affected areas and populations. So what we saw is, of course, it's still a challenge is to reach people who have been affected by a disaster or crisis or conflict. We saw that in many of the cases, whether that be remote access to areas in Haiti or in the Bangladesh floods. For example, that was across the board or the islands that were affected by also Nokten, the mountainous areas of Nepal. So in some cases, this is like because of geography, but in other contexts, for example, in Syria, it's also because of the nature of the conflict, where it's very hard to have access to certain populations for security reasons. So it can be a combination of that. The second point, availability of qualified surge staff, also came up again and again. Qualified staff locally, qualified staff within partners, within the INGOs, within the rosters. This still remains a challenge for organizations. It was also related to the fact that maybe organizations were pulled in different directions for different crises globally. So that remains a challenge. Also, the next point, access to rapid funding, is, as I said, it has improved, but it remains a major challenge, particularly for local organizations, national NGOs, local NGOs that were linked to this project through the INGOs as partners. And that came up again and again and again. Now, there has been some positive moves in this direction, where, for example, the START Fund, this was a START Network funded project overall. but the START Fund has said publicly it will open up its funding to make it easier, direct funding for local partners, and we've already seen some examples of that. That is changing, but perhaps not rapidly enough. Government policies that may hinder rapid search response. Yes, so this we saw, in certain contexts, whether that be in Nepal, where the tariffs, the customs fees that were put on material brought into the country changed. People having access to certain countries, visa restrictions, and more recently with the Rohingya response, where the authorities had rather strict rules in terms of organizations could work in the country and the type of activities they could carry out. Also related to the fact that it was a conflict-related crisis and their interpretation was maybe more disaster-related. So certain activities were very difficult to carry out, for example, such as protection from what we understood. So, organizations we saw had to work constantly to try and work with governments to try and, improve the access to be able to respond rapidly. And lastly, price inflation of surge materials locally was also something that was reported, that when funding was available, in many of the contexts we looked at, disaster affected mainly, when it was tarpaulins or roofing material, market forces pushed the prices up and made it difficult to obtain the materials needed. So these were some of the challenges. I think one of the overall challenges that we didn't mention here was, of course, maybe it's quite obvious, but you always have challenges in coordination and overlap and duplication between organizations on the ground in surge response. And as I said, there are some, and you have parallel systems in some cases between the UN, between the INGOs, between the local organizations, between the local authorities. There is some improvements of these areas, but it's still, very much room to be improved, and it really depends on the context and the actors in terms of how that sort of plays out. So this is basically an overview of some of the main sort of summary findings of what we saw. And if we go to the next slide, the final slide, you can actually, the full 6 reports that make up this tracking pieces are available online, and you can see the image here of the Rohingya crisis surge practice report that's available. Also, as Lucy mentioned, there is the report, the future of humanitarian search, which sort of was the one that summarized all the learning overall from the project. So I'll stop there, and then we'll open it up to questions for the remaining time, I would propose.
Thank you, Glenn. We have one question from Rahul. I'm going to unmute you, Rahul, so you can ask your question. I can't seem to do that.
No one's interested to see my empty desk, so I took it off.
Oh, okay, I can't seem to do that. We'll come back to that. We've got another one here. Okay, so from Michelle, at the end of the day, would you say that contextualization is the key word to meet challenges of surge response?
The simple answer is yes. That I think, no, from what we saw, contextual issues are very important, because we saw the significant differences, even though it's the same group of agencies, the way they could respond, for example, even in the same country. For example, Bangladesh floods, the way that they could respond to a natural disaster and to a conflict-related disaster 1 year later was quite interesting and quite different. And so I think the context issues are overwhelmingly important. And then we have what we could it's a terrible word, but systemic factors, like, how quick, what is really in place for local partners and local offices of INGOs to receive funding? What is in place? Because the person sitting in Dhaka can't do much about that if there's nothing in place for them to get funding. So you have this sort of systemic issues also, and like how easy is it for me to get the colleagues to come from the regional office in Bangkok or the neighboring office in India. So these are more, are these things in place? You have these more sort of systemic, what I would call factors also that do come into play. That's sort of what I would say.
Okay, let me just check that that's answered the question. Michelle, I've just unmuted you. Does that answer your question? Would you like to add anything? No. Okay, let's move on. From Colin Jacobs, we have, how is the challenge to the UN and INGO's leadership of surge responses by local actors manifest or shown itself?
Ooh, yes. I mean, I think that's a very good point. How does it manifest itself? I think, we can see examples where, for example, the Rohingya response, where the UN system was very much challenged, and their leadership in the response was very much challenged by the local authorities, perhaps not really for good reasons, perhaps. Where, for example, UNHCR should have been leading that, but IOM, International Organization for Migration, was the one that basically given the authority to lead by the authorities. So in that way, they're being challenged by the authorities. As I said, we could argue it's not perhaps based on what I would see correct maybe reasoning. At the same time, in other contexts, we would also have, for example, the Philippines, where the local network and the local response system, for example, for NOC-10, was quite good. And then the UN, I think, were challenged to be able to see that they couldn't not necessarily take the lead because they couldn't duplicate the existing local mechanisms for disaster response, which were quite well developed and, according to people on the ground, function quite well. Because one of the major criticisms made of the UN response to the Haiyan response 4 or 5 years ago in the Philippines was that they basically duplicated the structure of the authorities. And this was a criticism that's been written up in the evaluations, independent evaluations made of the UN response. So the UN is challenged, and the UN, of course, is trying to adapt its cluster system and to try, and we saw examples of that, to try and make it more inclusive of the local actors. But it still remains very much focused on the UN actors and the INGOs from what we've seen. But there are, of course, the UN are aware of this, and the localization debate is putting pressure on them to respond, as are the local authorities in many countries becoming more and more strengthened in both positive and negative senses, in terms of political strength and wanting control, and also strengthen in terms of really developing in a positive way their capacity to respond. I mean, I covered a couple of points.
Colin, would you like to add anything to answer your question?
Yeah, no, thanks, Glenn. That does broadly. I think it was really to understand how something like a UN, rather hierarchical, traditional, centralized type of organization could complement local capacity. And I think it's trying, but it's a slow process, as you say.
Yeah, exactly. I think they are trying, and they realize this, and haven't talked and met with different UN agencies in many countries. I think they are, but their systems are also deployed. The systems are also designed. If we look at the ECOSOC systems, are also basically designed on the fact that, if I could put a sort of crudely, people in, people out. So their systems are designed in that way, whereas a lot of the INGOs and local partners, it's much more about, doing preparedness work and making sure that the communities are ready. So it doesn't really suit that sort of person flying in, person flying out, which is still needed in many situations, as we saw in the Rohingya crisis or Nepal. But things, sort of crises in between, it's much more harder to have that approach, it seems.
Okay, thank you, Glenn and Colin. Rahul, I see that you've put your hand up. I'm just trying to unmute you. Would you like to ask your question, because you haven't written it down? Do you want to unmute yourself? I can't seem to do it. If not, I'll move on. No. Okay, we'll come back to you. So the next question is from Niall at Christian Aid. Could you just run through the findings on collaborative approaches in Haiti versus other contexts in the study? Why 50% in Haiti?
Oh, thanks, Niall. I think in Haiti, as I mentioned a little bit in the presentation on collaboration, there was a couple of factors that sort of meant less collaboration. One, I think a major factor was that many of the INGOs, not all, did not have established relationships in the country. So many had left after the earthquake of several years ago, the major one, and came back. So they didn't necessarily have established partnerships or even local offices. And those that did have local offices, the INGOs, if you compare it to another country like Bangladesh, what they said is that the ability to establish relationships with local organizations was far more difficult. And I think that's maybe a sort of comment on the civil society setup in Haiti, which is perhaps maybe not as developed from what people indicated compared to other contexts. So that's certainly one thing. I think the second thing was also maybe it was at the nature of the actual typhoon, hurricane, which led also to more sort of individualistic responses, whereas in other cases they were able to collaborate much more. So I think it was maybe also the nature of the actual sort of disaster. So I think this is sort of like the two points, and that came up, and it seemed, of course, the authorities in Haiti compared to Bangladesh and the Philippines are not as strong in terms of from what people said on the ground, in terms of their disaster preparedness and setup. And in those other countries, the authorities had more capacity to respond and to support than they did in Haiti. So that also, in terms of collaboration, had an impact, I think. So those are sort of like the 3 points I would sort of make the differences between these contexts.
Thanks, Glenn. Niall, I just wonder if you have anything to add or follow up on that?
No. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Glenn. I guess it's that one sort of it's outside of the Asia region, along with Zimbabwe, and I guess it's really, for me, it's a really interesting finding, because it's sort of in terms of the value in transforming research, there's a value in perhaps replicating some of the good practice, and I think this sort of comparative, albeit limited, comparative analysis is really useful, and I think those points are very valid. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Maybe to add, I think also Haiti is a bit special in that a French-speaking country, so it can't draw also very much in terms of like the neighboring countries, as it's not Spanish-speaking or English-speaking, which are the predominant languages in that region. So that's also a factor where it was much harder to draw also on staff, I think, from the region, according to staff. Not completely, and in some cases for the larger earthquake, you did have staff coming, for example, from INGOs from French-speaking Africa, because of linguistic being French-speaking. Yes.
Okay, thanks. We've got two more questions. We've got Teresa, who has asked, Did you notice any interesting differences in the same INGO responding to different crises, or the same country responding to different crises? So, for example, Bangladesh floods, Rohingya crisis.
Yes, interesting. No, I think it's a good point. I think between the countries, I think overall the organizations have, INGOs have certain, of course, specific approaches. Like, for example, ActionAid really does give priority to women-led responses, and that was something you saw duplicated across the different countries. Others, of course, have a specialization. IMC, it's mainly a medical. It is actually purely, I believe, a medical organization. So, of course, they had that specialization. And then, so you do have similarities. Then, of course, there was, of course, an adaptation to the context and, of course, to the needs of the crises. Like, for example, in Nepal, shelter was a big need, and many of the INGOs don't have shelter capacity. So that was something they needed to think about and bring in, but they didn't necessarily think to develop it into their range of activities for future crises, because they thought, well, based on what we've seen, we won't have this huge shelter need in the future, which, yeah, it's true. It didn't happen to such shelter needs to such an extent. And then I think, of course, within a country, yes, Bangladesh is a good example where if you compare the Bangladesh floods compared to the Rohingya crisis as to who could respond and what they could do, it did vary quite differently in terms of like an organization that could be very active in the floods could not be active in the Rohingya crisis, mainly, for example, in some cases, the authorities did not allow them to operate in the crisis, and that certainly is the case for several of the INGOs. And at the same time, there are other INGOs that were perhaps more active in the Rohingya crisis because they were allowed access, whereas others were not. So yes, you did have that sort of differences, once again, even within the same context, but that was also related to the nature of the crisis, one being disaster and one being conflict, affected with the fleeing of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. So this also very much, I think, and that's where what was interesting was the Rohingya crisis was the only one we looked at that was conflict related. So it would have been interesting actually to look at more conflict related crises, because it does change also. What's interesting, it does change the capacity of the INGOs and also local partners to respond in that regard.
Teresa, did you have anything more to add?
No, that's good. Thank you.
So we've got one more question from Rahul, who has typed it in. I still can't unmute you, Rahul, but I'll ask your question. When an INGO works on a surge collaboration with a local NGO and other partners, does the INGO verify the goal of collaboration is equal for all?
Yes, no, a very good point. I mean, I think what we heard also from local partners, not only from this research, but from other parts of the project was, yes, that the local partners have traditionally been seen as implementers and not necessarily equal partners. And that has changed to certain extents, where I think the local partners are having a greater say, and even at the level of the funding proposals often, but still often what does occur is it still does have that sort of implementation feel about it, in that maybe the INGO has a goal in mind, and then they're looking for partners who will fulfill that goal. So by the time they get to working with a local partner, it may be already decided what they need. Like, we need someone to, for example, support us in food distribution. So, you don't have much choice then as a local partner. Either you can or you cannot. At the same time, we do have organizations, I'm thinking of, for example, a project like Tier Fund, that would have established partners before a crisis in many of the countries where they're working. So they would have worked with them previously, so it would be a much more equal relationship. So it also depended on the modus operandi, you know, the way the actual INGO worked. And some of them honestly are much more sort of more focused on establishing partnerships with local organizations and partners, you know, in between crises, if you like, and others are not. And that comes back also more at the level of the overall philosophy of the organizations. And some are simply, I think, some INGOs are simply more community focused or not. And those that are not, I think are with localization agenda, are trying to move in that direction. But some, I think, are quite challenged, particularly those that have a direct model of delivery, where they really, their model of delivery is really, you know, mainly their staff being on the ground and delivering services directly to populations. They're the ones that are the most challenged in terms of, like, you know, working with local partners and adapting their ways to working.
Thanks,
Sorry, that was a long
Glenn.
response.
Yeah,
Rahul, you're
thank you.
unmuted. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, thank you for your answer. Yeah, just a quick thing is like all these things you said I feel that it's a very time consuming, and whenever the crisis happens, we have a very limited of time for an action. So is there any such a way where we can uh, get the things into action very quickly with the such collaborations with the local NGOs and the partners?
I think I think that's a good question, Ariel. I think what we saw was, of course, to be able to react rapidly is basically, yes, is to unfortunately having to put in a bit of work between the crises and have those pre-existing arrangements between the local partners and the organizations so everyone can be operational in a crisis situation. I know it's very hard, and that doesn't necessarily always happen, but that's what I would say is one of the solutions that organizations have tried to use, and it does seem to work in some cases.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, you had something to add. You said that I'm going to unmute you just so we get some more voices, if that's okay, on the webinar. There we go.
Yeah, just to add to Glenn's answer here, I think throughout the project we found that surge can be part of preparedness planning. So in times of non-emergency, agencies can come together and work on collaborative rosters, and agencies can, you know, identify staff for training, that kind of thing. So yeah, I just wanted to make the point that it can be part of preparedness.
Thank you, Lucy. That brings us to the end of our questions. Were there any final points you wanted to make, Glenn, before we close?
No, just to thank everyone, and to thank, of course, all the partners across the world that were involved in it and helped us with the research, as many people did participate. And as I said, all the research is available, publicly available online. So if you're interested, and you have my email contacts if you need any further information. And as Lucy mentioned, you know, the project is continuing in many aspects, so please do participate where you can. And we just hope that the research we did is of use and is of value for those working in this area. Thanks.
Thank you from us, Glenn, too. And what we usually do after our webinars is send you a link to the recording and send you the presentation and the links to the documents. So in the next few days, we will be sending that out to everyone that registered, so that you have that too. So thank you all very much. It was nice to have you online, and have a good day.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks again. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.